and welcome to another Tallbooks tutorial. My name is Samuel Burmeister and I'm the owner here at Tallbooks. Today is part 2 of the new payroll tutorial series for Xero. And this is probably the most important video of the 3 as it's going to take you through setting up new employees. As always, if you haven't already, watch the first video so you're across payroll settings and an overview, and then continue into this video to learn how to set up your new employees. I am a registered BAS agent, but please make sure that you get your own tailored advice. If you have any questions about your specific situation or employee, you can reach out to Fair Work, the ATO, or your accountant or bookkeeper for further information on setting up a new employee and getting that right guidance there. Cool. So what we're going to do now is set up a dummy employee in the demo company to show you through this process. Setting up the employee correctly is the most important thing because then everything else will be correct moving forward, makes your life a lot easier, and you're less likely to have payroll issues down the track. So make sure you follow this carefully. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments below. So you're going to go into the payroll menu and go to employees. And then we're going to click on New Employee, Add Employee. What you will need is all of the employee's payroll forms. So that can include things like an employee details form, TFN declaration, super choice form, some kind of contract. And also you want to make sure you've given that employee the National Employment Standards form so they know what they're entitled to in Australia. If you're watching this from another country, you might have your own compliance around employees. Just make sure they have all the relevant documentation. And if you're not sure, reach out to your governing body. So we're going to use a fake employee today, and let's just call them Bob Brown. Now, Bob is a marketing manager, so I'm going to put that in here. You don't need a job title, but it is a handy way to remind yourself of who the employee is, what they're doing, especially if you're a third party working with the business. You can also put in a gender. You want to have a mobile phone number for the employee. This allows you to invite them to the Xero app to, as well as the email address to enter timesheets, leave requests, update their personal information. So it's very important that you get that information. So make sure you've got a mobile number and email for the employee. So let's just give Bob a fake email address and a fake address. So once you've entered in this information you can see here, this is probably what I would consider the minimum that you should enter. If you can't get the job title or gender, that's okay, but ideally you've entered everything else here. It's also worthwhile entering in any emergency contact here for next of kin. So Bob's going to put his brother Steve, and you can put in the relationship and a phone number and email address. So that if you want to save this kind of information in Xero, you can at any time go to the details tab for that employee and find that information. So once you've entered this in and you save, the rest of the information will become available to enter. So now you'll note when we click save, all these extra tabs appear. So you want to work from left to right, top to bottom to make sure you don't miss out on anything. So in the employment tab, this is where you're going to need the contract and potentially the tax file declaration to help enter this step. So previously this looked a little different. Now in this refresher, you can see that the STP2 rollout has begun in Xero. It's now the 2nd of October 2022. And you need to specify the employment type. So most of you are going to be ticking employee here. Then you need to select an income type. And basically it's salary and wages, closely held, or working holiday maker. Once again, you're typically going to select salary and wages. You'd only select closely held if you currently have the closely held exemption with the ATO and you're reporting closely held employees quarterly. Even if it's a closely held employee, if you haven't been getting the quarterly exemption, select salary and wages. Working holiday maker, this would be on their tax file declaration form. If you've employed a working holiday maker, they have their own tax rules. You will need to select this. In this case, Bob is just a typical employee. So we're going to go salary and wages. Then the employment basis. So this should be on the contract and tax file declaration form. So we're going to say that Bob in this case is full-time. I'll then need to enter in Bob's start date, which was actually the 1st of October. And if Bob is under an award, then I can put that in here as well. So we're going to say that Bob is under the Clerk's Award, which is used for administration, bookkeeping, accounting, that kind of thing. And you can also put in what classification they are. So for example, if I knew that he was on the Clerk's Award level 1, year 1, for example, it would look like that. Each award has different classifications. If you're unsure, get HR advice or speak with Fair Work and they can help guide you to classifications. Payroll calendar. This is where we decide how often we're going to pay this employee. So in this case, you can see in the demo file, we've already got fortnightly, monthly, or weekly. I'm going to put Bob on the monthly salaried schedule. If you want, you can also select employee groups that you've set up. This is, once again, from video 1, a tracking option. So if I wanted to say that Bob was under the marketing group, I could set up employee groups for each section of the business. And then that way he'll show up under marketing when I use that field. You can also choose holiday groups, and basically that will feed in the holidays from the payroll settings. I personally prefer to leave that blank, but it's up to you. Ordinary earnings rate. Typically, you'll just have one, which is ordinary hours. If you want to separate your earnings rates between maybe direct and indirect, you might set up another one, but default will be ordinary hours for everyone out there. It'll then give you the option to choose whether this employee is authorized to approve leave requests or timesheets. That's up to you again. If you don't have timesheeted employees and you're the one managing all of this, you don't need to tick it. However, if you have a manager that you'd like approving leave and timesheets, go ahead and tick these. Lastly, on the employment tab, you add their super fund. So the rule with Xero is if you haven't already added the super fund under payroll settings, you cannot select it from the list. So if it's a new fund that's not listed here, I'm going to jump back into payroll settings, add the super fund, then I can come back into the employment tab and select the fund for the employee. So in tutorial 1, I added Australian Super. So we're going to select that for Bob, and we're going to pretend that his member number from his super choice form is the following. So now I've added all of this information. I am ready to save down the bottom right. Now we've got his employment information in there. You'll see that it's been saved and that it will be filed with the ATO when you next file STP. Next tab is taxes. And as you'd expect, the document that you should reference for this tab is the tax file number declaration. You need to make sure that you have a signed copy of this that you can cite so that you can select the relevant information. If this tax information is not set up correctly, the employee might not have the right amount of tax withheld, and that's not a good thing. So let's put in a fake tax file number in this case. If I get the right amount of numbers, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, we'll use a dummy default. Normally it lets you choose 1, 1, 1. Doesn't look like I can do that anymore. So in this case, you would enter their actual TFN. What I'm going to do is choose an exemption just for the demo. You can see here, there are certain cases where you don't need to provide a TFN, or what you will see quite often is someone that is awaiting a new tax file number. Maybe they're fresh in the country on a visa or something like that. They have a small period of time in which they can obtain one. Otherwise, you need to withhold the maximum amount of tax. So you can choose awaiting TFN in that case. But make sure if you've got any standard employees that they do provide you with their tax file number. Residency, 99% of the time it's going to be Australian resident. One thing that really confuses people here is they think people on visas are foreign residents. This is for tax purposes, not whether they're a resident of Australia. So that's an important difference there. So, for example, if I'm on a working visa, I am most likely treated as an Australian resident for tax purposes, even though I'm not an Australian resident. Unless they tick that they're a foreign resident on their tax file number, declaration form, or something similar, you should be selecting Australian resident. There's also an option for an approved withholding variation. Very rare to come across those, but if you get one of them, you can tick it and put in the percentage of variation. Then the tax scale. This is another new feature in Xero relating to single touch payroll. So you can see here, there are a few options here where people have different tax scales. Most of the time, you're going to select regular. Then you have to see what they've ticked on their form. Do they have any offsets or variations like HEX or help debt? If they do, you tick this and that will increase their tax withheld. Have they claimed the tax-free threshold? To explain this, basically, an employee in Australia is entitled typically to about 18,200 of salary and wages tax-free before tax starts being withheld. If they are only working for one employer, typically they would claim that tax-free threshold. If they're working for two or more employers, they will likely choose the tax-free threshold with the employer that employs them the most, where they earn the most money. So if Bob was working here at Tollbooks, but working 4 days a week somewhere else, he would claim the tax-free threshold there. And at Tollbooks, he would notify us that he's not going to claim this threshold, as you can only claim it from one employer. If the employee is not sure, they can check with the ATO or their advisor. If they only work for one business, typically you would claim it. And then you've also got here some options like whether they're eligible for leave loading, whether they have any other tax offsets, or whether they want you to increase the amount of tax withheld. These two are not very common. Leave loading is very common. If you're not sure whether they get leave loading and super on leave loading, check their award. You can look it up on Fair Work or give Fair Work a call. Leave loading is basically 17.5% most of the time, loading on top of their typical hourly rate while they're taking annual leave. So now you've filled that all out based on the tax file number declaration form. You're going to file it with the ATO, and that will count as you sending it off to the ATO. You don't need to mail anything off. In this case, we're just going to save it because it's a demo file. Move along to the Leave tab. The Leave tab is only applicable most of the time for permanent employees. So this is going to be for your full-timers and your part-timers. Start by assigning the default leave types, and that will provide you with annual leave and personal carers leave, also known as sick leave. Annual leave typically defaults to 4 weeks a year for most employees in Australia. Based on a 38-hour week, that would be 152 hours. Now, this is really important to get correct because I see a lot of mistakes here. So let's just break this down for a second. If I'm working on a 38-hour week, then I would get 4 times 38 or 4 weeks of annual leave for a full-time employee, which equals 152 hours. Now, this is not asking you how many hours of leave this employee accrues. This is asking you how many hours of leave would be accrued by a full-time employee. So if they're working a 38-hour week, that's 152. If they're working a 40-hour week, that's 160. If they're working a 37.5-hour week, it's 150. You need to make sure that that aligns with your weekly hours. For the amount of hours a full-time employee works in a monthly pay period, this will change. If you selected weekly, it would say weekly. If it was fortnightly, it would say fortnightly. Simply take the full-time weekly hours and multiply it. So in this case, what's been done by Xero is they've taken 38 hours a week times by 52 weeks in a year, and then divide that by 12 months, and that'll give you the 164. So that's correct for monthly. If this was fortnightly, it would be 76. If this was weekly, it would be 38. Once again, this is how many hours a full-time employee works. Do not enter the amount of hours that a part-timer works, because it's going to base this on the percentage they work compared to a full-timer. So it does that for you. Last thing you want to do here at the bottom is select paid out. Don't ask me why Xero doesn't automatically do this. Basically, I haven't come across an award yet where you don't get annual leave when you resign or you're fired. So 9 times out of 10, you're going to see this paid out. If you're unsure, check the award. But most of the time, annual leave is paid out when terminated or made redundant. So just ignore the hours that I adjusted in there, but that's how you set it up. Personal carers leave is typically the same thing, but half. So where you'd get 4 weeks of annual leave, you get 2 weeks of personal leave. Personal leave is also called sick leave, I guess in layman's terms, in case you're wondering where that is. Once again, this is the hours accrued by a full-timer. Then the hours they work in a monthly pay period as a full-timer. And sick leave is typically not paid out. But if your award is different, you can change it. Also, if you're under an award, say for example, the nurses award has higher leave for sick leave, then you can edit these details. So you save that. The only other thing you need to do here is assign leave types that don't exist already. So the most common one that I would say I've seen is time in lieu. Some employers like to pay time in lieu. So what they'll do is, back in video 1, you would have seen you can set up under payroll settings, leave items. You would go in there and create time in lieu as a category. And then I could come in here and assign a leave type and select that category that I've made. So if you do want to add your own leave types on top of the 2 standard, make sure you've added them first in the payroll settings, then assign them here. Cool. This is also where leave requests will show and where you can raise a new leave request within a specific employee. But most importantly, just make sure the annual and personal leave are set up correctly. If they're casual, they typically won't need this part set up. Next tab along is bank accounts. This is very straightforward. You need to select the text that you would like to appear on their bank statement when you pay them. So for example, if it's 12 books, it might be 12 books salary or 12 books paid. I'd put in Bob's account name that he's provided me with, his BSB, and his account number. Now you'll note here in Xero, it's got a handy feature that when you enter an actual BSB number in, it will pop up the top right and tell you what the branch is. If you don't see that appear, there's probably an error in the BSB number, and you can double check with the employee to make sure, or do a search online. So once I've set up the bank account, I can save it. If you have a special situation where they want you to split the pay across multiple, you can add a bank account. You can see here, you can put the amount that goes into each account based on your preferences. Next tab along is Payslips. You don't need to do anything here for the setup. It's just worth knowing that this is where the individual payslip history shows for each employee. Then we come along to the pay template. To me, this is the most important section of the employee section for ensuring that the employee gets the correct amount of pay and the correct amount of super. Because the pay template is what will automatically load up for this employee when you process their pay. So what we're doing is we're templating their weekly, fortnightly, or monthly pay based on their hourly or salary rate, right? So let's say that Bob is on $100,000 a year. I would click Add Earnings, and then I would select the earnings rate that he is receiving. So for most people, it's ordinary hours. Then I've got the option to choose earnings rate, enter a rate, or an annual salary. So we just said that Bob was on $100,000 a year, so I would select annual salary. He works a standard full-time week of 38 hours. and receives 100,000 a year. So what Xero will then do is calculate, okay, I need to divide 100,000 across 38 hours a week, each pay period. If they're on an hourly rate instead of a salary, then you would select the other option that we had there. So I'll just show you. Add earnings line, ordinary hours, enter rate. This is where you would typically set up casuals and part-timers who don't have a salary. If you don't have set hours for the employee, you can enter in Xero and then put in their hourly rates. If they have set hours and a set rate, then you might put that in, and Xero will then automatically pay this amount when you load the pay run, which we'll go through in the next video. But basically, you're now templating it. If they're a casual or their hours fluctuate, put Xero in the hours column so that you can enter that manually when processing the pay. Cool. Now we've entered that. You can also add other earnings lines, like if they get a monthly commission or they have other fees or top ups, then you can add them here as well. If they're not regular, leave them out of the template and you can add them in the pay run itself. You can then also add a deduction line. Deduction lines are not super common, but they're not rare either. So someone might have an FBT deduction, they might pay their lease through the business, they might want a pre or post tax deduction, or it might be a compulsory one that you've been asked to add to their pay. Also, if they're paying their union fees or subscriptions through their wages, then you can choose that option there as well. And you can then select what type of deduction it is. Is it a fixed amount each period? Is it a percentage of their pre-tax income or post-tax? If you do have a specific deduction, make sure you get advice on whether it's pre or post-tax and how much it should be. The next line is super. So if you are going to set up an employee, typically the two lines that you have to enter are earnings line and super. With super, the handy thing is Xero allows you just to click add super line and then OK to add the standard statutory rate of super, which at recording of this video is 10.5%. If you want to put in a different amount on top of that, so for example, let's say they get 10.5%, but your business also tops that up to 12%, you could add another super line and you could choose percentage of earnings and then enter that percentage. So if we've already got 10.5% here, adding another 1.5 will now top that up. And you would need to choose the contribution type. So here you would say it's an additional employer contribution because the employer has done it. If the employee wants to salary sacrifice, which is quite common, there's also an option for that. So add super line, choose pre-tax voluntary contribution, and then whether they have a percentage or a fixed amount, you can put that in. Typically what I see is employees will ask you for a fixed amount. So you can select fixed amounts and then put in the amount they would like to salary sacrifice each pay. So in this case, what we're going to say is that Bob is on an annual salary full-time for 100,000. We've added his super at statutory rate, which means 10.5% of 100,000 will be added to super. And Bob has also requested that $500 pre-tax comes out as a voluntary contribution to his super, which most people know as a salary sacrifice. Once you've then set up their template, you can save it, and this employee is now ready to be paid. The last thing I would do here, I'm not going to go into opening balances or notes, by the way, because they're not super common. If you do need to enter these, there are great support notes in the Xero articles for bringing in opening balances. But if you've got to pay template, 99% of the time, that's all you need to do. The last step that I would do is go back to the employees tab, and you can now invite Bob or your new employee to the Xero app. And that's the one I mentioned earlier that allows them to lodge timesheets, leave requests, and download their payslips. So all you need to do there is make sure they have a mobile phone number and email address saved, tick the employee, and then invite to Xero Me. You can do them all at once as well. Anyone who doesn't already have access to the Xero Me app will be invited when you click that. And there you go. That's how you set up an employee in Xero Payroll. Join next video to learn how to process pay runs in Xero.